Hi and welcome back to my channel. I'm Sam and this is Sam Stacks, a channel where I talk about books, pop culture, nostalgia, generally things that I find interesting. And if you think that you might have some interests in common with me, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you can stay on top of every time I release a video. Today I'll be talking about the show What We Do in the Shadows in terms of vampires, gender, and subjectivity. So in case you're unfamiliar with What We Do in the Shadows, it is a show on FX that's produced by Taika Waititi and Jermaine Clement, and it follows 4 vampires living in contemporary Staten Island. We have the traditional blood-sucking vampires, Nandor the Relentless, Laszlo Cravensworth, and Nadia of Antipaxos, and then we also have the energy vampire Colin Robinson. And the series follows them and their human familiar, a sort of like servant companion. His role changes throughout the series. Guillermo, trying to exist in contemporary Staten Island, navigate the politics of being a vampire and like the vampiric council, and basically navigate the struggles of their daily lives. Most of the characters within this show can be identified as queer in their sexuality, but also through their gender presentation and assumptions of gender roles in relation to their vampirism. This gives me like grounds for like this deeper investigation of the way that queerness and perceptions of the self are presented within the show. So basically today I'm going to be talking about how the vampires of What We Do in the Shadows face both freedom and restrictions in their experiences with vampirism. They are free from human societal expectations of gender and sexuality, but they are also forced to contend with humans as subjects in their own right, instead of just like subjugatable food sources. So today I'm going to be talking from the frameworks of Jacques Lacan and Judith Butler to explain these concepts, and how the vampires of What We Do in the Shadows play with gender presentation and identity throughout the show. So we're all familiar with different iterations of the vampire. The basic like Eastern European vampire myth is the one that informs our conceptions of it today. You know, the corpse that is risen from the dead and is fattened on the blood of their neighbors. That's kind of what Bram Stoker then adapted into Dracula. Of course, Dracula is a highly sexualized version of a vampire, but this has informed most presentations and vampires in media since the late 1800s. So the vampires of What We Do in the Shadows largely play into the tropes established by Dracula, and follow this more traditional vampire myth, although of course it does at times parody this traditional vampire. First, let's look at the vampires' perceptions of themselves and their internal narratives of what it means to be a vampire. So Jacques Lacan, a French philosopher, discussed ideas of the self. So Lacan posits basically that we conceive of our identity in terms of what we are not. So we look at the world around us and we see ourselves in a generally like negative light. We look at another person and we say, oh, I am not them, so therefore I am me. So if we're going to apply this kind of concept to the show of What We Do in the Shadows, I think the best example of this is the character of Guillermo. Guillermo constantly defines himself throughout the series of what he is not. He is not a vampire. And Nandor constantly and relentlessly turns down his requests to be turned. Much of the comedy of the show also comes from Lacan's concept of the big other, which is an idealized external perception of who you are supposed to be in your head. So I think we often see this throughout the show through Nandor calling back to his human life of like the time that he made the Euphrates run red with blood. And we often see it in other characters as they are comparing themselves to like the vampires of media. Like I think of the I want to look like the vampires from Twilight from the pilot episode. So they are looking at examples of media. They are looking at these other vampires that they encounter in their daily lives, and seeing them as like the perfect other. And so therefore when they look at themselves and compare them to those vampires, they come up short. This leads to feelings of inadequacy within the vampires. So much of the comedy then comes from them having to learn to adapt. Each vampire struggles with adaptation to the modern world, and they undergo struggles such as figuring out how to use email, trying to gain American citizenship, and attending a Super Bowl or Super Owl party. They misunderstand human life and are also somewhat misfits within the vampire world. You see a lot of other vampires looking down on them, or they don't fit like the mold because they're too considerate, or they're too attached to a certain way of life, that other vampires don't necessarily like want to hang out with them. Other vampires that appear in the show, such as the Guide from the Vampiric Council, are a lot more secure in their vampirism. They don't show as much empathy for humans as the main cast does, and they don't seem to necessarily pine for their human lives like our main characters here do. So next, let's look at the characters of What We Do in the Shadows in terms of sexuality and gender. So I'm going to be drawing from some frameworks set up by Judith Butler. She is a philosopher who deals with a lot of gender and sexuality throughout her work. So first, we'll use Butler's conceptions of sexuality and gender in terms of reproductive capabilities. So Butler proposes a definition, an alternative gendering based off of reproductive capabilities. So there would be two genders, as in able to reproduce and not able to reproduce. This can be combined then with a discussion of the gendering of vampiric immortality, which combines a sense of homoeroticism to vampirism. Every character in What We Do in the Shadows exhibits queer desires throughout the show, whether explicitly or implicitly. For example, Nandor frequently mentions his 37 wives, and it's later revealed that some of those were male. The married couple, Nadja and Laszlo, have sexual encounters with people of all sorts of genders, and with each other and with other people. So like, we got some poly stuff going on here, right? And then Colin, for example, he falls for a half-bird siren woman. And then Guillermo comes out as canonically queer in the latest season. Beyond actual sexual encounters, the vampiric genre itself is rife with homoeroticism. This is exhibited through male vampires feeding on male victims, female vampires feeding on female victims. This twists the traditional gender role of male dominating female and queers it through liberating this sense of domination from gender. The new hierarchy created by vampires then is not men over women, but vampires over humans. The vampires of What We Do in the Shadows live on the outskirts of society. They have to subjugate humans for food sources, so they feel no need to abide by societal norms that their prey has to follow. Their immortality and removal from society allows them to not to be able to follow any queer sexual desires that they might have. They do not have to live this sort of worthy life predicated on heteronormativity because their life is on the margins. So let's get to Colin for a second here. So Colin Robinson is the fourth vampire within this main cast, and he is an energy vampire. So that means that he doesn't drink blood, he actually absorbs the energy of the people around him. So he can feed off of basically anybody. He's also what is called a daywalker, so he isn't affected by sunlight like regular vampires are. So Colin's ability to then be able to gain energy from other vampires makes him actually more dominant than the blood-sucking vampires. So if the blood-sucking vampires are able to feed off of humans who are at the bottom, and then Colin can feed off of the vampires, that really makes him an apex predator here. And that is shown through season 2, episode 5, where Colin overindulges on negative emotions and becomes like supremely powerful. To return back to Judith Butler then, vampires cannot physically bear offspring. So then this is connected back to that idea of this non-reproductive gender. However, all vampires, excluding energy vampires as far as we know, I think, are capable of creating vampiric offspring. So this allows vampires of any gender to take that maternal creative role. And then this then queers the concept of reproduction. Additionally, on sort of a smaller note, if we're to look at like the costuming used for the vampires, going back to Butler, Butler has this idea that gender is based off of what we do on the outside, like gender is an external thing. So if you're looking at like the costuming of the characters then, they dress in these like flamboyant gothic costumes with rich fabrics and furs, and this can be attributed then to their lack of desires to keep up with like the trends of the human world, but at the same time, it allows them, their removal from the human world allows them to exhibit themselves and identify with a certain degree of flamboyance. In conclusion, the vampires of What We Do in the Shadows are freed from human societal conventions through their immortality. Their separation from mortal society and their innate power over humans allows them to follow their sexual desires without fear of repudiation or shame. However, the vampires are not free from these internal concepts of the big other, of this idealized self, and these narratives about what it means to be a perfect vampire. They struggle with this internalized big other, constantly comparing themselves to it. This leads to much of the comedy within the show, as discrepancies between their lived reality and their idealized picture fail to match up. The vampires throughout the show must reckon with what it means to be a vampire and how to live in a community of both humans and other vampires. So that's it. That's today's video. Let me know if this is the sort of thing that you're interested in. This was actually based off of a paper that I presented at a conference that I knew was like, I'm not gonna publish this or anything. It's not something that I typically write about, but I am interested. If this is something that you'd want to see more of, let me know. Other than that, please hit that like and subscribe button, and I will see you next time. Thank you.